When young Edward V was escorted into the Tower of London, ostensibly to prepare for his coronation, he stepped into a royal apartment outfitted with every luxury, including a magnificent, perfectly made bed. A bed that, unbeknownst to him, was already occupied by the chilling blueprint of his own demise. He was only 12 years old, a boy king, suddenly thrust onto the stage of England's tumultuous history. And the Tower, a fortress that had served as both palace and prison for centuries, was meant to be his temporary, secure residence. But as he lay down for the first time in those regal sheets, a silent, unseen occupant already awaited him, weaving a fate so cruel it would forever haunt the halls of British monarchy. This was not a physical presence, not a ghost of battles past, but something far more insidious. The cold, calculated ambition of his uncle, Edward's appointed protector, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Richard's plan had already been laid, a dark design for the throne, and this seemingly perfect royal chamber was merely its stage, its ultimate silent tomb. The very air in that room, thick with the scent of fresh linens and polished wood, carried the faint, acrid tang of betrayal, a scent only detectable in hindsight. The young king, so full of the eager hope of a boy about to claim his inheritance, could not have known that every comfort was merely a gilded cage, every plush pillow a silent witness to a destiny already sealed. Edward's journey to London had begun not long before, after the sudden, shocking death of his father, King Edward IV, in April 1483. The young prince had been at Ludlow Castle, learning the ways of governance, surrounded by his Woodville relatives, his mother, Queen Elizabeth Woodville's family. The news of his father's passing would have shattered his youthful innocence, plunging him into the gravitas of kingship. Imagine the scene, the hurried messages, the hushed voices, the sudden weight of a crown too heavy for a child's head. His path to the capital was meant to be a grand procession, a public display of continuity and royal power. But even then, shadows gathered. His uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, a man of formidable reputation and military prowess, intercepted the royal party. Richard, with his loyalists, seized control of the young king, arresting his maternal uncle and half-brother, Lord Rivers and Richard Grey, and sending them north under armed guard. The ostensible reason was to protect the king from perceived Woodville influence, but already the warning bells should have been ringing for anyone paying close attention. Edward, however, was a child, likely confused and somewhat intimidated, but ultimately trusting of his father's brother. He saw Richard as a protector, a strong hand guiding him through a period of national uncertainty. What could be more reassuring than the embrace of family? Richard then escorted his nephew into London. It was April 1483, a spring day, perhaps bright and deceptively cheerful. The city's populace gathered, lining the streets, eager to catch a glimpse of their new sovereign. They would have seen a boy, small for his 12 years, dressed in royal finery, riding with a retinue of knights and lords. Cheers likely rose from the crowd, a mix of genuine hope and the customary adulation for a new monarch. But underneath the pageantry, a subtle shift was occurring. Richard, exercising his power as protector, directed the king not to Westminster Palace, the traditional seat of government and coronation preparations, but to the Tower of London. Not to the grim dungeons, of course, but to the royal apartments, a self-contained palace within the fortress walls. He reassured everyone, including young Edward, that this was merely for his safety, a secure stronghold where he could reside until the coronation, away from the factions and unrest of the city.
The royal apartments were indeed comfortable, designed for a king's residence, far from the stereotypical image of a dark, damp prison cell. They had fireplaces, tapestries, carved beds, and servants to attend to every need. So Edward, believing he was moving into a temporary but perfectly acceptable royal residence, settled into his new house. The thick stone walls, meant to keep enemies out, now unknowingly served to keep the young king in. Life within the tower walls for Edward V would have initially felt ordinary, perhaps even a little exciting for a boy. There were gardens within the inner ward, courtyards for exercise, and the comforting routine of royal life, albeit in a more confined setting. His meals would have been elaborate, his days filled with lessons, prayer, and perhaps games. The bed, the central piece of his chamber, would have been a significant comfort, a place of rest, of dreams, and perhaps of childish thoughts about his upcoming coronation. Can you imagine the heavy velvet drapes, the embroidered sheets, the sense of security such a grand bed might offer a young boy, miles away from his mother and familiar surroundings? It promised refuge, warmth, and the peaceful slumber of a future king. But the real power lay not with the boy on the perfect bed, but with the man who had placed him there. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was a master strategist, a man hardened by years of civil war. He moved swiftly to consolidate his power, portraying himself as the true champion of England against the perceived corruption of the Woodville faction. He began to isolate Edward, gradually replacing the king's personal attendants and household staff with his own loyal men. The Woodville queen, Elizabeth, fearing for her other children, sought sanctuary in Westminster Abbey, taking her younger son, Richard, Duke of York, and her daughters with her. This act of seeking sanctuary was a public signal of her distrust and fear, a desperate measure that must have sent shivers down the spines of many in London. Then came the demand for the younger prince. Richard insisted that Edward V needed the companionship of his brother for their shared coronation. He pressured Elizabeth Woodville, promising the boy's safety and return. The queen, torn between maternal instinct and the immense political pressure, eventually relented. So, Richard, Duke of York, a lively and intelligent 9-year-old, was brought from the sanctuary of Westminster Abbey and into the Tower, joining his elder brother in the seemingly perfect royal apartments. Now, 2 young princes shared the same fate, the same luxurious chamber, and the same bed, or perhaps 2 separate ones in the same suite. The perfect bed had welcomed another occupant, a companion for young Edward, but in reality, it only tightened the trap, adding another vulnerable piece to Richard's grim chess game. As weeks turned into months, the isolation of the princes deepened. The pretense of coronation preparations began to wear thin. Messengers from outside were scrutinized, visitors became rare, and eventually their access to the outside world was all but cut off. The sounds of London, once a comforting hum, must have become a distant, muffled roar, like a fading memory. The once bright prospects of a coronation, initially set for June 22nd, were pushed back, first to November, then indefinitely. Excuses were made. The realm was unstable, the necessary preparations incomplete. But the true reason, a much darker one, simmered beneath the surface of official pronouncements. The outside world began to whisper, questions turning into open anxieties. Where were the princes? Why were they not seen? Richard's campaign of delegitimization intensified. Preachers were brought forth, declaring from pulpits that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid due to a pre-contract with another woman. Then came the demand for the younger prince. Richard, Duke of York, a lively and intelligent 9-year-old, was brought from the sanctuary of Westminster Abbey and into the Tower, joining his elder brother in the seemingly perfect royal apartments. Now, 2 young princes shared the same fate, the same luxurious chamber, and the same bed, or perhaps 2 separate ones in the same suite. The perfect bed had welcomed another occupant, a companion for young Edward, but in reality, it only tightened the trap, adding another vulnerable piece to Richard's grim chess game. As weeks turned into months, the isolation of the princes deepened. The pretense of coronation preparations began to wear thin. Messengers from outside were scrutinized, visitors became rare, and eventually their access to the outside world was all but cut off. The sounds of London, once a comforting hum, must have become a distant, muffled roar, like a fading memory. The once bright prospects of a coronation, initially set for June 22nd, were pushed back, first to November, then indefinitely. Excuses were made, the realm was unstable, the necessary preparations incomplete. But the true reason, a much darker one, simmered beneath the surface of official pronouncements. The outside world began to whisper, questions turning into open anxieties. Richard's campaign of delegitimization intensified. Preachers were brought forth, declaring from pulpits that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid due to a pre-contract with another woman.
This, if true, meant that Edward V and his siblings were illegitimate, therefore ineligible for the throne. The scandal, manufactured with cruel precision, stripped the young king of his birthright in the eyes of the law and, crucially, in the eyes of many of the people. This was the final, devastating blow to the boy's claim, not through battle or assassination, but through the insidious power of legal maneuvering and public smear. Imagine the confusion, the fear, the utter helplessness Edward and Richard must have felt as they heard these rumors, perhaps filtered through their dwindling loyal attendants, or even worse, from their new, unfamiliar guards. Their very identity, their right to exist as princes, was being systematically dismantled. Then the inevitable happened. On June 25, 1483, a group of lords, ostensibly representing the will of the people, petitioned Richard to take the crown himself. They declared the princes illegitimate and hailed Richard as the true heir. 3 days later, on June 28, Richard accepted. On July 6th, just 3 months after Edward IV's death, Richard III was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey. The celebrations would have echoed through London, the trumpets and cheers, a cruel counterpoint to the silence enveloping the young princes in the Tower. The boys were now not just isolated, but actively disinherited, imprisoned by their own uncle, and utterly powerless. The perfect bed in their royal chamber had ceased to be a temporary resting place and had become, irrevocably, their prison cell. With Richard III firmly on the throne, the princes in the Tower became a monumental liability. Their very existence was a threat, a potential rallying point for anyone who sought to overthrow the new king. Historical records become scarce after this point, deliberate in their vagueness. The last reliable sightings of the princes occurred in the late summer of 1483. Chroniclers note that they were seen playing in the garden of the Tower, but that these appearances grew less and less frequent until they ceased altogether. A profound silence descended upon their chamber, a silence that terrified their remaining supporters outside the walls. Where did they go? What became of them? This is where history gives way to speculation, to the chilling certainty of an unanswered question. If you find these untold stories as compelling as I do, consider subscribing. It's how we keep these echoes of history from fading entirely. What truly struck me about this tragedy is the cold, calculated nature of their disappearance. It wasn't a sudden, passionate act of violence, but a slow, suffocating closure. The prevailing theory, long held by historians, points the finger squarely at Richard III. The act itself is believed to have been carried out by Sir James Tyrrell, a loyal servant of Richard. The account comes primarily from Sir Thomas More's History of Richard III, written decades later, which details Tyrrell's confession under torture. More describes Tyrrell being sent to the Tower by Richard, tasked with ending the lives of the young princes. Imagine the atmosphere within the Tower on the night the deed was done. The air would have been heavy with the damp chill of the Thames, the stones themselves seeming to absorb all light and sound. The guards, perhaps fewer in number, or deliberately chosen for their ruthless loyalty, would have moved with an unnerving stealth.
The flickering torchlight would cast long, dancing shadows, turning familiar corners into terrifying, unknown depths. The sounds that usually permeated the fortress, the clinking of armor, the distant calls of sentries, the lapping of the river against the quay, would have been suppressed, leaving only a pervasive, anxious quiet. Sir James Tyrrell, along with his accomplices, Miles Forrest and John Dighton, would have approached the royal apartment in the dead of night.
The heavy oak door, once a symbol of the prince's security, now offered no protection. It would have swung open silently or been carefully unbarred. Inside, the chamber would have been dark, save for perhaps a dying ember in the fireplace, casting a weak orange glow on the magnificent bed where the two boys lay, sleeping soundly, utterly unaware of the terror about to descend upon them. The air, once filled with childish dreams, was now thick with unspoken horror. The method, as described by Moore, is particularly brutal in its simplicity: suffocation. Pillows, soft and luxurious, were pressed down over the faces of the sleeping princes. No dramatic struggle, no loud cries that might alert distant sentries, just muffled sounds, the desperate, uncomprehending thrashing of young bodies fading into stillness. Think of the absolute helplessness, the betrayal of that final suffocating breath. The perfect bed, designed for comfort and royal rest, became their final, silent coffin. It makes you wonder, doesn't it, how easily a trusted protector can become a predator, and how quickly loyalty can curdle into ambition. Have you ever seen such a profound betrayal unfold? Once the deed was done, the bodies of the princes needed to disappear. Sir James Tyrrell reportedly ordered their burial at the foot of a staircase within the tower. The earth would have been hastily turned, the small bodies interred in a secret, unmarked grave. The men involved would have sworn to secrecy, their lives dependent on their silence. The chamber was then tidied, the bedcloth smoothed, every trace of the horrific event meticulously erased. The smell of fear, of death, would have been scrubbed away, replaced by the sterile odor of damp stone and stale air. From that night forward, the royal apartment, once a symbol of hope, became an empty shell, a silent witness to a crime that would echo through centuries. The disappearance of the princes, however, did not bring peace to Richard III's reign. The whispers grew into a roar. The haunting question of their fate became a powerful weapon against him. Rumors circulated that they had escaped, that they were still alive, fueling rebellions and bolstering rival claimants to the throne. The specter of the murdered princes clung to Richard, eroding his legitimacy and staining his reputation. This unresolved mystery, this great wrong, undeniably contributed to his downfall. Just 2 years later, in 1485, Richard III met his own violent end at the Battle of Bosworth Field, becoming the last English king to die in battle. The crown passed to Henry Tudor, who became Henry VII, establishing the Tudor dynasty. The new king, to solidify his own claim, married Elizabeth of York, the prince's eldest sister. But even his reign was shadowed by persistent pretenders, claiming to be one of the lost princes. For nearly 2 centuries, the fate of the princes remained officially unknown, a gaping hole in England's history. Then, in 1674, during renovations within the tower, workmen uncovered a wooden chest buried deep beneath the foundations of a staircase near the White Tower. Inside, they found the small skeletons of 2 children. These bones were later moved and reinterred in Westminster Abbey by order of King Charles II, finally granting the young princess a royal resting place, albeit centuries too late. Forensic analysis in 1933 confirmed the bones belonged to 2 pre-adolescent children. And while definitive DNA evidence is impossible, the consensus among historians remains that these were indeed the remains of Edward V and Richard, Duke of York. The perfect bed had given way to an unmarked grave, only to be found by chance centuries after their last terrified breaths.
The story of the Princes in the Tower is more than just a historical whodunit. It's a stark reminder of power's corrupting influence and the enduring ache of unresolved justice.
É uma história de inocência, brutalmente extinguida por rutelãs ambição, uma calcionária narrativa ética entre os veres estonos da Torre de Londres. A nova House, que prometia segurança, becou uma cage, e o Perfect Bed Within It transformou-se em um silencioso deathbed, e os soft pillows maflando os últimos craios de 2 jovens boys. O Someone Else, que já estava nele, não era uma pessoa, mas o cold, pré-determinado destiny de uma mercenária plot, voatando por eles o momento que cruzassem o threshold. Deu sua story, linga, um haunting whisper de o que mais poderia ter sido, um profundo silêncio que ainda demanda respostas. O que parte dessa história ressoa mais com você, em séculos lá atrás? A vulnerabilidade de poder, a traição dentro de família ou a lastrimado shadow de uma injustiça não resolvida? A ressonância dessa história, séculos depois, reside talvez na sua cruel universalidade. Ela nos força a confrontar a fragilidade da inocência diante de uma ambição sem limites, um eco sombrio que se repete em inúmeras épocas e culturas. A Torre de Londres, com suas pedras frias e história sangrenta, tornou-se não apenas um palco para o drama desses 2 príncipes, mas um monumento à escuridão que pode habitar o coração humano, capaz de tramar a queda dos mais jovens e vulneráveis para solidificar um poder recém-adquirido. Imagine o silêncio que se abateu sobre aqueles aposentos após o último suspiro. Um silêncio pesado, cúmplice, preenchido apenas pelo farfalhar das tochas e o ranger distante das portas do castelo. O cheiro de pedra úmida e o ar pesado de segredos não contados ainda parecem impregnar as muralhas, se você prestar atenção. O que se pensava ser uma moradia temporária de proteção tornou-se um sepulcro não marcado, testemunha silenciosa da brutalidade de um jogo de poder onde não havia regras. Essa é a verdadeira essência do terror, a traição mais íntima, a que vem de quem deveria proteger. Compartilhe nos comentários qual desses aspectos, a ambição real, a traição familiar ou a sede de justiça, mais te perturba nessa saga real. A busca por respostas sobre o destino dos príncipes nunca cessou completamente, alimentando lendas e suspeitas por gerações. Cada nova teoria, cada osso encontrado, reacende a chama de uma indignação antiga, um desejo humano fundamental por justiça, mesmo que póstuma e tardia. Não é apenas uma curiosidade histórica, é a necessidade de entender como a verdade pode ser tão convenientemente obscurecida e como a impunidade pode lançar uma sombra tão longa. Se essa imersão em mistérios históricos que desafiam a lógica e a moral te cativa, deixe um gostei neste vídeo e considere se juntar à nossa comunidade para mais narrativas como esta. Afinal, a cama perfeita que aguardava esses meninos na sua nova casa era, na realidade, um poço de trevas, onde a presença de alguém mais, a sombra da usurpação e da morte, já estava instalada, esperando silenciosamente. Eles não foram para uma prisão vazia, foram entregues a um destino selado que os aguardava como um hospedeiro indesejado, já ocupando o espaço que lhes fora prometido. A história dos príncipes na torre é um lembrete vívido de que nem sempre são monstros óbvios que roubam a paz e a vida, mas sim as engrenagens calculistas da política e do poder. Que lições podemos tirar de um passado onde a inocência foi tão facilmente esmagada pela busca desenfreada por um trono? E como isso se reflete nas histórias de hoje? The legacy of the princes extends beyond the historical facts. It has permeated literature, art, and popular culture, becoming a touchstone for stories of lost innocence and political intrigue. Shakespeare himself immortalized Richard III as the villain, forever tying the king to the murder of his nephews. Yet, for all the artistic interpretations, the human tragedy at its core remains unchanged. 2 young boys entrusted to their uncle, who instead orchestrated their quiet, desperate end. The Tower of London stands today, its ancient walls still echoing with countless stories. But few resonate with such poignant sadness as the fate of the two young princes who sought solace in a perfect bed, only to find the cold embrace of their own preordained demise already waiting for them within its folds. Their final hours were not marked by grand battles or public executions, but by a quiet, insidious terror, a slow realization of betrayal. The last thing they might have heard was the soft rustle of movement, the creak of a floorboard, before darkness descended. The last thing they might have felt was the pressure of the pillow, the warmth of their brother beside them, then nothing. Their story serves as a chilling testament to how fragile life can be, especially when power and ambition intertwine with such lethal force. It reminds us that even in the most seemingly secure and luxurious places, if dark intentions are already present, they can turn sanctuary into a tomb and a perfect bed into the coldest of graves. This enduring mystery continues to capture our imaginations because it speaks to a universal fear, the unseen enemy, the betrayal from within, and the profound injustice of innocence destroyed. The tower, their new house, held their perfect bed, but it held something else too, the secret of their final tragic rest.